tell me about this paper you wrote on computation in the brain and whether or not the brain is a computer.
We think about the brain as a computer. We treat it as a computer in cognitive science and neuroscience. We understand it in sort of computational terms. And I guess that raises the question for a lot of people of whether the brain actually is a computer. And that's a very thorny question. And it's one that we haven't quite answered because we don't really know what it is to be a computer. And so we have a lot of debates about what it is to be a computer. My point in that debate is just that none of those debates really matter to what we're doing when we treat the brain in computational terms. I think that what we're doing when we talk about the brain as a computer is we're introducing a certain set of resources, a certain set of ways of thinking about the brain, conceptual resources, modeling tools, and things like that, that help us build models of the brain. And none of this hinges on the brain being a computer in any way. So we can sort of get away from these sort of definitional or semantic or metaphysical debates about what it is to be a computer. And we can say some more interesting things about the kind of resources that are available to computational cognitive science and what they might help us do.
So the question of whether or not the brain is a computer, I mean, where would you stand on it? Because it's so there you're kind of saying it's not really necessarily that important. We model it as a computer, but you know, what I mean, if we call the brain a computer, could we call lots of things computers? I mean, tell me a bit about what we mean by computation.
Yeah, that's one of the things is that a lot of people will say, try to understand computation by saying something's a computer if it has an isomorphism, just some mapping to the stages of an algorithm. So if it follows an algorithm. And that immediately has this problem that you touched on, that it turns out that everything's a computer. A rock maps to like an addition algorithm because you can treat the rock's state now as one state, and then its state in the next second is another state, and its state in the next second is a third state. And all you need to map to a 2 + 2 = 4 computation is 3 states. You just assign the first one the number 2, the second one the number 2, and the third one the number 4. So a lot of the debate is about do we have a way of defining computation that makes the brain a computer but doesn't make everything else a computer, which would sort of trivialize the idea of computation and trivialize what we're doing when we treat the brain in computational terms. So I think if there is an account of what it is to be a computer, it's probably something like that mapping account. It's something like that really simple. You just have to map to the stages of a computation. And it doesn't really matter that everything's a computer and whatever, because what we're doing when we talk about things in computational terms is not saying, oh, this belongs to the category computer, and then trying to infer something from that. What we're doing is sort of introducing these resources and ways of thinking about its causal structure.
It's interesting there. So you could call the brain a computer, but it's kind of trivial because it's kind of from your perspective. I mean, it's like, what do you want to call a computer? And it's sort of based on what is, you could assign mappings to it, like, say, for example, some inert thing like a rock. And so then it's a computer. And so, I mean, is there because I guess a rock, though, is kind of different to the kind of more complex algorithms that, like, we think of a laptop, the computers that we have today run. I mean, maybe we're going to get to why it's still not necessarily helpful to think about computers, but I guess I'm wondering, to what degree then is it useful to analogize the brain to the kinds of computers we would usually think of? I mean, is that something that cognitive science does? Tell me a bit more about computational modeling of the brain.
Yeah, so a lot of computational modeling, I mean, it's not so much giving an analogy between the brain and like your laptop or something like that.
Sure, okay.
That's pretty rare. Largely, it is modeling the brain using certain resources from computer science. So in the early days of computational cognitive science, that was Turing machines. And more recently, it's been more complicated computational structures, and especially neural networks and like deep learning models. And we now think of the brain in terms of those instead of these sort of more old school computational structures. And sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, it's interesting. So that even if as we think about modeling the brain as a computer, that kind of changes over time as sort of it's almost as the background of computer science, mathematics changes, right? So now we'll have neural networks. We have these almost different modeling techniques, and we can kind of go back and impose that on the brain. So
Yeah.
interesting, and yeah.
Yeah, and the techniques are changing constantly, and there is a really interesting back and forth where uh, you discover things about the brain in neuroscience. You discover things like, recurrent connections, where you don't just have information being passed forward, but you have information being passed backwards to earlier stages in the process. So neurons will connect to neurons that had fed into them, neurons earlier in the process. And that is at least part of the inspiration for recurrent connections in neural networks. And so you get tools from computer science being used in neuroscience, and then you get findings in neuroscience and results in neuroscience showing people in computer science, hey, there might be this interesting thing that we could build into a neural network. And so you get both directions with what's so far been a really fruitful back and forth.
So okay, so it's interesting. Okay, multiple fronts. So it's this has been valuable, and so that in one sense you might say kind of validates this kind of approach, and so I mean, and maybe a deep question then when we say, well, okay, these are helpful approaches to modeling the brain and mind, but to what degree are these computational approaches some way they are what the brain is? Is this is this a reasonable sort of question and thought for me to be having? Like now it's okay, these are useful modeling tools, but to what degree does the I mean would I be right in saying that the brain is incredibly complex and there are, no matter what tools we bring to it, or computational or otherwise, they're going to be very low resolution or simplified compared to the actual brain? I mean, tell me a bit about what we're trying to do when we're trying to model and understand the brain.
Uh, yeah, this is I honestly, this may be the problem of cognitive neuroscience is that, yeah, the brain is a massively complex system. It has something in the order of 100 billion neurons. Those neurons have something in the order of like 100 times that many connections and synapses between them, or 1,000 times that many. And that's just looking at neurons, which are the things that we've had the easiest access to. That's not looking at the other kinds of cells that are all over the place in the brain and that seem to do information processing as well. It is people say things like it's the most complicated object in the universe. It's at least very complicated. It's at least a very, very complicated system, and it's one that we don't have a ton of access to because its parts are not just very small, they're also inside living organisms. And if you want to look at the human brain, um, you have to do that with either non-invasive methods, which are very coarse grain. It's very hard to look at like individual neurons or something without opening up the brain, or you have to look at a brain when the person is deceased and has donated their brain to science or their body to science or something. And then you're looking at a brain that has degraded a little bit and also isn't functioning. And the interesting thing about the brain is how it functions and how activity here influences activity there, things like that. And that you don't have in a dead brain. So, massively complicated system. We have very poor access to it compared to the access we have to other complicated systems. And yeah, this means we have to do an incredible amount of simplification. Our models of the brain don't have anything like 96 billion terms for one for each neuron. They'll have like 7. So to some extent, this is capturing just high level patterns. And what's important about that is the high level patterns, not necessarily all of the neurons or whatever cells make them up. But to some extent, it is just a way of trying to get by without having to account for all of the complexity in the brain. Uh, and one thing that's useful about computational tools is that they're kind of designed to do that. They're kind of designed to help you think about a system without thinking about its lower level details. When you think about a computer program, for like as a sort of simple example, when you think about a computer program or like an if-then loop or something, you can think about it at that level, and you don't have to think about the transistors that make up the process. So it gives you a really nice sort of high-level language for thinking about what the brain is doing. And other computational tools are sort of designed to do a similar thing. So yeah, one of the roles they play is absolutely simplifying and abstracting and finding a way of getting away from the causal mess and finding high-level patterns in all of that detail.
I see. That's very helpful. So it's interesting. So, we first said, okay, the brain is incredibly complex, right? I've heard it said too, right? The most complicated object in the universe, perhaps. And it's quite the task to hand that over to neuroscientists and go, have a go then, And not only that, you can't just pick it apart, if it's in a living organism, to try and study it, too deeply, you might just destroy the brain. And that's not very helpful. So it's also very difficult to model. But with the computational approach, it's interesting because then you don't have to necessarily care too much, or you can put that in the background precisely how computation is implemented, and you can just think in sort of the patterns of interaction of different parts. And in general, okay, could we like reverse engineer how would in general a system solve such a problem by breaking it down? Or I might be getting computation wrong, so but like I guess from that, I'm interested in well, specifically, and how is computation then helpful? So you talked a bit about it there. You can break things down without caring too much about the low levels. So how is it helpful and being helpful in cognitive science?
So take an example from early color vision is one of the really nice examples of this, because we have like fairly simple computational models of it. It's a very complicated thing, and our models are very simplified, and then some of our models are more complex, but we do have very simple models of it. And we're talking about processes that are very early in the brain, like still in the retina. So we have decent access to them, and they're somewhat measurable, and we can look at the physiology and connections there. What the computational theories of early color vision do is to split up neurons into classes depending on what kind of cell they are. So there are 3 types of cone cell, or more in the human retina, and then rod cells. And the rod cells aren't really relevant for color vision. And then the 3 types of cone cell feed out to ultimately to what are called retinal ganglion cells. The 3 types of cone cell are called S, M, and L because they're sensitive to short, medium, and wavelength light. And the retinal ganglion cells seem to be just computing algorithms that are fairly simple and fairly just straightforward arithmetical operations that subtract L cone activity from M cone activity. So M minus L, or S minus L plus M, or something like that. And we get a lot of our color vision capacities from these comparisons of the wavelengths that are coming to our retinas. What the computational approach is doing there is giving us, for one thing, a sort of general framework for thinking about this process, right? In terms of algorithms, in terms of steps between input and output, or steps between the light that the light activating cells in your retina and you seeing a particular color. It's giving us that way of thinking about the retina and its processing. It's giving us sort of specific tools. So we sometimes think about like computational complexity in this kind of processing, and computational cost in this kind of processing. And then, yeah, it's giving us a way, by thinking algorithmically, of connecting the input to the output, connecting the light that comes into the system to the specific thing that we're trying to explain, which is the fact that a person sees a particular color or discriminates between colors, because we have an algorithm that outputs in a specification of that color. So at a general level, that's computational thinking is helping us do in that case, at least.
I see what you mean, though. That's helpful to give that example. And so it's interesting then, because I kind of wanted to, what comes to my mind is then going, okay, so it's helpful if you can break down, this is how color vision could work. but this might be a more general question of science more broadly than just computational approaches to neuroscience, is to what degree does that map on to what is actually going on in the brain? I mean, do you think it's possible that there can be computational models of the brain, but that work pretty elegantly, but we don't think that's actually what the brain does? I mean, tell me a bit about how
Yeah.
this kind of gets into I mean, a lot of what your work, it's like, again, to what degree is something, again, actually a computer, and what does this mean, and how useful is it to think about these questions?
Yeah. So yeah, we can have models that are very useful and elegant, but don't actually reflect how a system works.
Hmm.
I guess there's a couple ways of approaching that. One is just to point out, like, these models of color vision do capture pretty well the behavior of the retinal ganglion cells that we think are implementing these computations, but there's a lot of variability in the cell's activity that these computations don't capture, right? They're at best an approximation of what the cells are doing. And you'd probably expect that, because nobody sat down and hand wired these cells, right? They're a sort of the brain sort of organizes itself on the fly without the kind of access to information that a programmer or an engineer would have. So, and partly by stochastic or random processes. So you're going to expect a lot of variability, and you're going to expect that these models only capture a sort of general pattern, not all of the details. Computational models can also be even further off, though. So neuroscientists like to distinguish between what models, why models, and how models. So what models just try to capture a system's behavior at a high level. So if your model predicts that the system will do X and it does X, your what model is totally successful. How models try to capture the process by which the system brings about X, brings about its behavior. So if your model predicts what the system will do, but if your model does it differently than the system, it's a successful what model, a model of what the system does. It's not a successful how model, a model of the processes by which the system does that thing. And then there are why models, which try to explain why what a system does is ultimately useful or rational. Even if they don't capture what the system is doing, they might show how the system is performing a task. They might show that performing the task like the system does is optimal, or like the best way of doing it. And that's very useful when you think about sort of evolutionary considerations and the fact that organisms learn and learn to behave in their environments. Figuring out the best way of doing it is useful, or the best way of doing a task. So you have many, many, many different purposes for models, only some of which are actually capturing the fine-grained processes that go on inside the brain.
I see. And so when we think, I mean, is it something that is common in cognitive science debates over, because whether then the brain is or is not actually a computer, and like the metaphysical question of what computation is? Like, I mean, I assume it must be in the sense that this is why you care to have a paper on it, because from what you say here, it kind of makes sense. Okay, I mean, it's a modeling technique, and it's scientifically helpful. So why has this been an issue in cognitive science?
I think the real reason it's been an issue is that there are non-computational approaches to modeling the brain, and they're also successful in their own ways. So there are approaches that treat the brain as a dynamical system. These sort of start from a point that we talked about earlier. The brain is a massively complex system, and from the fact that we have tools in science for modeling complexity, right? There is such a thing as complexity science. People might have heard of like chaos theory from Jurassic Park or something. There are tools that have been developed for modeling systems that have these sort of very dense causal structures that are very complex. And a lot of those tools are not, to think about the brain in terms of algorithms, but to think about the brain in terms of sort of high order system level parameters, or to think about the way population activity changes, and to think about the possible space, the space that population activity can occupy, and how it moves throughout that space. That's a sort of very, very poor description of dynamical systems theory approaches to the brain. But I think the reason we have debates about whether the brain is a computer is because we really have debates about how we should model the brain. And then sometimes it can seem, we can mistakenly think it's going to be useful to go up a level of abstraction. And so instead of saying, should we model the brain with these tools or these tools from complexity theory and dynamical systems theory, or from computer science and computability theory and so on, we ask, well, is the brain a computer or is it a dynamical system? That can
Ah.
seem like a really reasonable way of intervening on this question. Well, which system is it? Is it a dynamical system, in which case we model it with these resources, or is it a computer, in which case we model it with these resources? But then we find out, oh, wait a second, what is a computer is a hopelessly difficult question. And when we finally answer that question, or think we've answered that question, we actually don't get much purchase on the debates that we were trying to intervene on. So anyways, I think it's a lot more useful to stay at that level of how should we model the brain and think about what our different modeling strategies do and what strengths they have, rather than going up to a level of, well, which category does the brain belong to, computer or dynamical system?
It's so right. There's debates over how the different approaches to model the brain, and it's interesting because reading your paper, you go, it's not necessarily the case that. I mean, maybe computational are the best methods. I mean, it's these are open questions, but again, it's that helps me understand. But it's the fact that it's really not helpful to then start going, oh well, what actually is the brain? Not that, I mean, so it's interesting because it's not that it's not a interesting philosophical question about what kind of thing is it. But would you say it's kind of above the pay grade of neuroscientists thinking about computational approaches? I mean, what is the place of that kind of question then?
Yeah, so there's this really weird thing where maybe, I don't know, 50 years ago, that would have been a philosophical question. What is computation? Which things are computers? And neuroscientists probably wouldn't have worried too much about that question. They still don't. They just get on with their work and do good work using the notion of computation. And philosophers would have thought, cool, well, whatever the neuroscientists are doing, my question is this metaphysical question. Which things are computers? Where is computation in the universe? In the past 50 years, partly due to the influence of like a few people like Patricia Churchland and people who tried to bring neuroscience and philosophy together, and partly just due to the sort of progression of philosophy and the way that it found that it could interact with science, philosophers have started taking these questions about what is computation, or what is free will, or what is a person or something, and tried to bring those into more tight contact with science. And that has resulted in this phenomenon where now people try to take these questions, what is computation, and try to interpret neuroscientific debates about computation in these philosophical terms, in terms of this sort of metaphysical question. That's the one thing I think is a mistake. If philosophers want to ask like what computation is, or what free will is, or what a person is, those are fine questions. Some of them more useful than others. Some of them you're going to make more progress on than others. But as philosophical questions, I don't really have a problem. People do metaphysics. That's great. It's the idea that these metaphysical questions are going to help us connect to the methodological questions that neuroscientists are asking, how we should model the brain. It's that idea that I'm skeptical of. So I think these questions have a place in philosophy. It's just that this really weird, interesting space of research that's kind of in flux about where philosophy and the humanities connect to the sciences. That's a place where I think philosophers have to use different tools than the sort of standard definitions and trying to give the nature of computation or trying to figure out what computation is. I think we need a different set of tools that say, what is thinking in computational terms doing for us?
It's interesting. So that, I mean, it's interesting that you bring up that some neuroscientists kind of try to bring in these more philosophical notions, but it's interesting as well that in a lot of science, for example, in physics and the success of fundamental sciences, that you kind of one can ignore philosophical questions, and so you don't want to ignore them, but it's kind of a place of someone has to take up the mantle, and I think it's interesting then you saying the need then to separate like who kind of has what problems, and understanding what problems are we actually tackling here, right? Because if neuroscientists are kind of having to debate constantly and without even realizing it that they're trying to think about a deep metaphysical question, when they're trying to scientifically understand the brain, then there's going to be confusion.
Yeah, and there's going to be confusion, especially if philosophers come in and say, oh, that's actually a deep metaphysical question, when it's not, when it's just a practical question about what tools you want to use.
Yes. Go on. You want to say something?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay. Well, it's I wonder, do you think that it's because with current day AI, especially and LLMs, and the fact that we are often using these kind of some of the approaches anyway. I mean, I guess LLMs are quite black box and they're kind of in a sense unscientific, but I guess that's why what I want to kind of ask about is the degree to which when we create AI with computational basis, do then questions of its intelligence, its cognition, its consciousness come in such that it's important to understand the relationship between computation and the brain and the mind.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think those questions come up. I do have a sort of similar take on them as I do on these other scientific questions. I think for questions like, well, does this AI system have a mind? I think those are a lot like questions about, well, is the brain a computer? Right? It's not so important whether something belongs to the category is a computer or has a mind, especially with AI systems currently, which don't have minds. I guess I don't know if I need to make that assumption, but I think it's pretty obvious they don't have minds. What's really important is what we do when we think about them as if they had minds, or we think about them with mental terms and predicates. So what happens when we think about an LLM as not just outputting text, but telling us what it believes? What happens when an LLM outputs text that says, like, hey, can you do this for me? Or can you give me this information? And we say, we don't just treat that as a text output that we then interpret. We treat that as expressing something the LLM wants. What are we doing when we think about them in terms of these sort of mental properties and ideas? I think that's the really interesting question when we come to like LLMs and minds, and do LLMs have minds? I think again the interesting question is to back off a second and say, what are we doing when we think about things as having minds? And there's some philosophical work on that, right? Dan Dennett famously has this work on what he calls intentional systems theory, where he thinks about things like beliefs. And what he wants to do is to not necessarily to explain, what is it to have a belief and which things count as having beliefs. He wants to explain what we do when we think about something in terms of its beliefs. And he thinks what we do is we give ourselves a sort of strategy for predicting what it's going to do. Because when you think about something as having beliefs, one of the essential things that we know about beliefs is that they are supposed to be true and that they are supposed to be consistent, right? If you think about an LLM as expressing as just outputting text and it tells you one thing and then it contradicts itself, you're not going to be too bothered. If you really think about it as outputting as expressing its beliefs and it tells you one thing and then it tells you the opposite, you're going to automatically feel a pull to correct it. You're going to want to say, wait a second, you can't have both of those things. They're inconsistent, right? You're going to want to point out that its beliefs are wrong or something's gone wrong. So when we think about something in terms of beliefs, we think about the relationships that beliefs are supposed to have to each other and the relationships that they're supposed to have to desires. So if I want a glass of water and I believe that the water is in the kitchen, I should go to the kitchen, right? Beliefs interact with desires in some fairly straightforward ways. And so when we think about a system as having beliefs and desires, we give ourselves a way of predicting what it's going to do based on the way its beliefs are going to interact with its desires. That's one of the things we do when we think about things in mental terms. I think we do a lot of other things as well. The things that might be a little more worrying when we think about LLMs. But yeah, again, that's kind of where I think the question goes, is not necessarily does ChatGPT have a mind, but what are we doing when we apply mental terms to it?
Yes, it's interesting because if you were to do kind of what you're saying, it kind of then corroborates the idea that LLMs don't have a mind, in the sense that, have a theory of mind and then go, what would beliefs have to be like in these other terms, and then apply that to LLMs, and it maybe doesn't make much sense. But that's like another kind of way of lens by which to see the world, and it's interesting because I wonder if you'd agree that perhaps the issue you've been touching on this whole podcast of the problems of thinking about the metaphysical question of whether something is a computer. Do you think there's been a almost problem where if we think about the brain as being a computer in some genuine sense, then when we have computational models like with LLMs, we kind of start going, hey, if the brain is the mind, then is that a computer? Then maybe the LLMs are a mind, and we kind of do this equivalence, which when we should try and think about whether AI could have a mind, but we kind of get a bit stuck because we make this link between computation between both of them.
Yeah, this is an implication I haven't really thought about, but I guess like if you were living 100 years ago or 150 years ago, when it was very common to think of the brain as on the analogy with a steam engine, the natural thought would have been, well, if I build a complicated enough steam engine, maybe it'll have a mind. So yeah, maybe that's one of the reasons we're drawn into these questions. When we think about the brain on the model of computation, it's extremely natural to think, oh, well, if I build a complicated enough computer, maybe it'll have a mind. And maybe it will. I don't really come down on either side of that. But I also think even for human beings who do clearly have minds, it's not that clear what we get out of just saying, oh, okay, these human beings belong to the category of things that have minds. That doesn't seem to have many implications for what we do or how we understand each other or how we treat each other. What does seem to have implications for what we do and how we understand each other and how we treat each other are questions about how we're going to interpret each other, or whether we're going to think of each other in terms of mental or non-mental predicates. It makes a big difference if I think about you in terms of your beliefs and desires, or just as a physical system that sort of outputs behaviors. That's what seems to matter, is the way we think, not necessarily the categories things belong to.
Right, rather than being so strict and stuck in these kind of almost these kind of concepts when and definitions, when, as you say, like maybe you do build a complex enough LLM or something, and there could be a mind. Like we can argue. It's fine to have debates about whether that's even a good question, and the degree to which they could or could not have minds. But again, it's to be stuck on whether or not, well, is it not a computer, and therefore is the brain a computer? We kind of can get stuck.
Or does the LLM have beliefs? There are a lot of people who are debating that kind of question, but I think this really, really interesting and weird thing that's happening where people are using LLMs to write their wedding vows. I know people who have had someone in their life pass away, and then they found out that the obituary in the local newspaper was written by an LLM. It's not that much of a stretch to think people are going to use LLMs to write their eulogies and things like that. And I think a lot of this is supported by a kind of, if you just think about these things as outputting text, as outputting the text that they predict will follow in a sequence of text, you're probably not going to think, oh, that could write me a eulogy. If you think about them as information processing systems, as systems that are capable of reasoning, and systems that have beliefs or more complicated mental states, you're probably going to think, oh, that's the kind of thing that could write a eulogy, right? Not just because it could predict the right text, but because it would be considering the right things, because it would be thinking about the right things, right? The idea of writing a eulogy is not just to produce appropriate text; it's to to produce that text while having a sort of respect and compassion for the deceased. So I think the reason we're seeing LLMs used in a lot of cases is because in a lot of these cases where we might think it's problematic, is because people are thinking of them in these sort of inflated terms. People are thinking of them as things that have genuine beliefs or desires, and treating them as if they have beliefs and desires, and then using them as if they were capable of the things that something with beliefs and desires would be capable of. So I think, yeah, I think there are like really, really interesting implications and really important implications about of the way we think about LLMs that don't necessarily have to do with whether it actually does have beliefs or not, but that have to do with the relationship we have to them, given the way we think about them.
So, I think I'm okay. I'm thinking I'm understanding this, but it's interesting. So, if imagining the LLM does write a really good eulogy, and imagine it is really considerate, it ends up being like the thing you want. You know, you see it like actually like I think this is a good eulogy, and it's even though I don't know. I mean, so is it kind of like when we then take a stance on the kind of thing it is? I mean, because do you think it's misguided to think of it as something that has beliefs? I assume you would that take the stance, but but nevertheless you can take it. Because I guess one thing I'm getting at is almost when I hear you talk about these things, it makes me think of Michael Levin, and when he talks about kind of what stance you take on a system kind of will determine what you find in some senses. For example, I mean, you might not be familiar with his work, but when he, for example, like looks at single-celled organisms, looks at basal cognition, and it's kind of to what degree do you kind of appreciate the competencies of a system as to and then if you assume there's nothing here, then you might not find anything. But you know, what stance do you take when you go and look at it? Do you think this is relevant here?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and so if you think about LLMs as having like very complicated capacities and like a beliefs and understanding of the world, you might go looking for like a world model in the LLM and its like vector representations or something. And if you think of them just as like outputting text, you probably won't be going looking for that structure in the model. You'll be just thinking about like its learning rule and the way it generates the next word from in a sequence of words or something like that. Yeah, so absolutely it'll change the kind of things you look for.
So do you think it's misguided to try and find a world model within an LLM?
Not necessarily. No, I mean it. I think there are. I think there are some surprising, I guess, coincidences or some surprising features of LLMs after they've been trained where they do have internal states that seem to correspond to features of the world, and not just features of text, but like there are some people looking at whether they have a model of like the world itself, a model of the relationship between colors that so where it's the vector representation for the word red is closer to the representation for the word orange and further from the representation of the word blue, even though those words don't appear closer and further in its text corpus. Um, if that's the case, then it has some kind of model of the world that does not just reduce to a model of the text it was given. And if that's how it produces coherent text, and if that's how it produces text that comes across as intelligent and comprehensible in the way it does, that's an extremely interesting fact. That's an extremely interesting finding. So I don't want to like, yeah, I think for a lot of purposes,
No,
it's a
no, yeah.
mistake to think of LLMs as having beliefs or desires or whatever, because that feeds into behavior that I think is probably inappropriate and unfortunate. But I don't want to close off these avenues of investigation. I think they're probably going to find interesting things, and regardless, I'm not the kind of person to close off a investigation in advance on sort of a priori considerations. I think we have to carry it through and see what happens.
That's really helpful. That that because it's maybe a kind of surprising thing. Like maybe it does have these kind of models, like because it's. I talked to someone recently about kind of interpretability in AI, and almost
Yeah.
you make it, but to what degree? What is underlying it so that it does have the output it does? kind of reminds me a bit of, more generally, some of the ways we study the brain as well. Of like, we kind of see the things we're doing, but what is the best approach to kind of look at it? What is the future of your work, either along these questions or just in general, as we finish this off?
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of stuff on these questions. A bit more stuff in collaboration with philosophers and neuroscientists on both like methodology in neuroscience, and then also how AI tools are being used in science. I'm doing a little bit of work on this issue about how we interpret LLMs and how we understand LLMs and what that does, sort of starting from the idea that having an LLM write an obituary is a bad thing, and trying to think about what capacities it would take to be a competent writer of a eulogy, or to be something that it would make sense to give that task to, and what exactly we've done, what way of thinking we've adopted, or what perspective we've adopted, where we think that LLMs are competent to write a eulogy, or sorry, to write an obituary. So I'm doing a bit of work on that, and also just sort of trying to extend this approach and think very generally about categories and when it's useful to worry about category membership, and is the brain a computer, or when it's not useful to think about category membership, and when it's useful to just think about these sort of first order questions about what strategies we take to explain a system, and to understand a system, and to figure out how to navigate or treat a system.
And that concludes this podcast with Andrew Richmond. You can check out his paper that we discussed in the description below. And if you like this, then maybe check out some related videos here and subscribe if you're new. Thank you.